So our mission is really about helping schools to make this equitable transition to zero carbon, while also preparing youth to build sustainable futures. So recognizing that schools are the places where we prepare the generation, the next generation for what's to come. And that is a really important and changing mission as we face climate change. So Jonathan is kind of the educator in this duo, and I am the climate change leader in this duo. And so together we kind of complement one another. My own personal journey in this work started about 12 or so years ago when I worked with a firm that many of you probably know, Coldham & Hartman, here in Amherst, to do a deep energy retrofit of my house on Cottage Street. I can get really personal here with this crew that knows Amherst and Western Mass so well. So at the time I was a new mom, I knew nothing about this stuff, but my husband and I knew we were kind of here for good and we wanted to really make smart decisions about our home. And so we, ended up building at the time what was, a new concept to us, an all electric home that made all the energy that it needs to do its thing. So, 12 years later, we are really value the place here that we are raising our family. And it has spawned in both my husband and I, kind of professional interest in this area. So for about 8 years, I founded and ran a solar finance company that helped make solar accessible to more households. And the part of that work that I loved was that it was about really hearts and minds of bringing clean energy into people's homes and, changing the conversation at the kitchen table. And so when I got introduced to Jonathan and he started talking about kind of schools, that same hearts and minds aspect of that work really attracted me. So that's kind of my journey into doing this work to support America's public schools. The two key messages I want you to walk away from tonight with are one that, to really have, to be able to double click on this notion that schools are critical sites for climate action. There's lots of climate action that all of us are working towards, but, I think about schools as really punching above their weight, if you will, in this realm. And that now was a particularly potent moment for local advocacy to advance climate ready schools. So those are the two big messages, I want to really drive home tonight. So the first, why are schools such important places for this work? We talk about this in a kind of variety of ways. School buildings are the place where students spend so much of their lives, right? So it's really core to supporting student health and students' ability to learn. And that itself is under threat because of things like extreme weather. Schools are and need to be going forward really key ingredients in enhancing community resilience. If you look at the extreme heat planning for cities like Boston, they are counting on schools to be the places that will serve as cooling centers when there are.
Hold on a sec. Darcy, are you able to mute people who are making noise?
I will try to do that right now.
No problem. So schools are really key to community resilience. We saw this during COVID, to take another, kind of challenge when food insecure students, weren't able to get meals when schools were closed. So it's really important that schools are able to adapt to the threats that climate represents for us. Schools are critical to building the workforce of the future. If we just, want to think about it through a capitalist modality, we need a ton of solar installers. We need a ton of electricians. We need a ton of human power to do the work of transforming our economy. And that starts in our schools. And lastly, we talk about schools as really a public face for climate work. 1 out of every 6 Americans walks through or visits a public school every school day. And it provides a great showcase for us to do this work of transforming our built environment. And again, tying all that together, you can think about the threads of equity that are can be woven through all of those topics. To go a little bit deeper on the equity piece and just to pick 2 threads, you can think about clean air and extreme heat. Many of our schools, if we think about our schools in Springfield or Holyoke, are really exposed to poor indoor air by being proximate to highways. Many of you know and could probably educate me about the threats to student health of riding diesel school buses. And things like asthma disproportionately affect students of color. And that is, has to do with all these layered risks of school buses and poor housing and poor air quality in neighborhoods and in our schools. Turning to extreme heat, we see that an extraordinary number of students attend schools on what's called a heat island, areas that are going to get much hotter faster as temperatures rise, that the vast majority of those schools are not prepared with adequate access to air conditioning. And then again, this disproportionately affects students of color, with hot school days already responsible for 5% of the gap in test scores between white students and students of color. So it's already showing up in the experience of students of color as they move through our public education system. To drill down to our context here in Massachusetts, school buildings are a sizable part of our building stock with 186 million square feet of buildings. To contextualize that, our roadmap and targets for decarbonizing our buildings targets 300 million square feet of commercial buildings to be retrofit. So 186 out of 300 is our target that we need to retrofit to hit our 2030 target. We have about 9,000 buses with their own kind of carbon footprint. We spend a lot of money every year on these buildings without, kind of a climate lens. So 2.6 billion that we're spending on these buildings anyway, every year. And again, they touch a vast number of students and a vast number of students from low-income households. So again, thinking about schools as really an opportunity to disrupt patterns of inequity. And, the big kind of headline here is, we have this big infrastructure that touches all these communities and all these households. And there's no plan right now to bring this infrastructure into line with our climate goals. So it's really kind of sitting on the sidelines. That was not helped when the state got the data wrong on kind of sizing up our school buildings in our built environment. These are graphs from our 2050 decarbonization roadmap, and schools are way down at the bottom there. But that data is wrong, and they should be way up there as a top 5 building type. And the top when you look at it through a lens of the public sector. So again, these are all my slides to kind of drive home the point that schools are a really important sector for climate action. So now is the moment, this is my second point, right? Now is really the moment for local advocacy on this issue, and why there's really new economics at play, and there's a bunch of new advocacy tools that I hope to put into all of your hands. So cherry-picked a few of the big highlights here, but we've got money from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's supporting school bus electrification. That's the one on the left there. In the middle, we've got the Inflation Reduction Act, which will vastly defray the upfront costs for things like solar and ground source heat pumps, which are a clean source of heating and cooling for school buildings. And then on the right, we've got new support and a kind of new pathway with technical assistance from our utilities, in particular Eversource here for us in Western Mass, that can help schools on this journey to decarbonize, as it really is, a multi-step, multi-year process to decarbonize our school infrastructure. So digging down on one particular piece that is really central, and just to bring this to light with a concrete example, ground source heat pumps, heating and cooling is the major energy user in schools, and it really defines a lot of the kind of comfort and safety of our school buildings. And as I mentioned in the slide before, the Inflation Reduction Act has a new incentive that provides schools with 30 to 50% off the cost of this really key technology. There's no kind of competition for this incentive. It is, uncapped and it's available for 10 years. So this is really a piece that, all schools need to be figuring out whether they are candidates for ground source heat pumps and thinking about making a plan so that when their existing heating system, which by and large, across the Commonwealth, those are fossil fuel burning systems, when that heating system is ready to be replaced, that the school has a plan to transition to heat pumps, and if possible, a ground source heat pump. And the federal government is here to defray, 30 to 50% of that upfront cost. This is vastly changing the economics of this technology that used to be the most expensive and is now, as I'm hearing from engineers across the country that are doing this work, it is increasingly coming in as the least first cost option for many schools, especially in new construction situations. In Western Mass, we have the opportunity to pair that with incentives from the utility, also for ground source heat pumps. And that incentive, depending on the size of the system, could be another several $1,000,000. So this is really changing the economics of this key technology for advancing climate-ready schools in Western Massachusetts. I took the numbers from our project here in Amherst that many of you will be aware of when we're building a new school. These are, preliminary numbers of the cost of this ground source heat pump, the cost of the solar that we expect to install to offset our energy use, given the numbers that are available. And these might be slightly dated at this point, but these were from slides a few months ago. This technology was going to cost us $13.7 million before these incentives. Now, with those mass save incentives that we just talked about from our utility and the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, this is now turning what used to be a $13.7 million price tag for these two pieces to somewhere from 5.2 to 8 million. So this, again, is just, look, it's still millions of dollars, but this is radically changing the economics of this source of clean heat and cooling for schools. The Eversource program that I mentioned, they have just established a new deep energy retrofit pathway that is available for schools, and that can help schools kind of make this journey also. And so here's the consultant that is responsible for municipal customers in all of Western Mass. Matthew, I spoke with him a few weeks ago, and he's excited to get as many schools and municipal buildings as possible into this new deep energy retrofit offering. So again, this is for existing buildings as opposed to the new construction that we were just talking about in Amherst. So this is a great resource, and I am personally going to try and get as many schools as possible in Western Mass into this deep energy retrofit offering. And then to pair, so that's kind of the new economic story is, new incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act and other federal dollars, new incentives from our utilities and new technical assistance from our utilities. On the advocacy side, we've got a bunch of new tools for local advocates that really want to take on this issue and engage with their local district leaders. One, this is the resource, kind of detailing all these Inflation Reduction Act new supports that are available. So you can download this from, this is Planet Ed. It goes through in great detail with all the legislative language and references, kind of what is available for schools in the Inflation Reduction Act. This is a great tool for to share with certainly heads of facilities, but also kind of design teams that may be working on long-term facilities planning and new construction work. Next, we've got a paper that we just released that really goes deep on HVAC systems. We just released this paper with RMI. And again, it focuses on this key piece of equipment that is responsible for the lion's share of energy use and carbon emissions from schools. And it's written not for, the technical audience, but it's really written for your school board member, for your superintendent, for your other policymakers that are interested in understanding like how they should think about HVAC choices in the context of student health and learning, what the opportunities are here. So really, again, for a non-technical audience to help engage folks on this topic. The reason we focused on this piece, again, is they are the responsible for the vast majority of energy usage. So I'm showing here kind of the percent of energy usage in New England schools that you can attribute to these HVAC systems, and it's well over half. That's the chart on the left. And then on the right, you're seeing that, almost all of those systems in our schools today are burning fossil fuels. Over, about 98% of our schools are still reliant on fossil fuels for heating. So we've got lots of work to do to transition our schools from burning fossil fuels to using heat pumps for heating and cooling. So that was the motivation for doing that paper. The third resource that I want to put in your hands is this really framework that looks more broadly at what climate action schools look like. So it's not just about HVAC systems, but it's really more broadly looking at these buckets of mitigation, adaptation, education, and equity. It's got frameworks for local leaders and district actions, and is just a great, really robust resource for anyone interested in helping schools on this journey. And then the last advocacy tool I wanted to arm you all with is a great new toolkit and a set of videos from Rewiring America, Electrify Everything in Your School Handbook, another 76 or so pages or 68 pages there of goodness. It's really a toolkit of toolkits with lots of links and examples of model policies and all sorts of good stuff in here. So I would highly recommend this work from Rewiring America. And if that wasn't enough for you, you can find a lot more on our website. We have a whole Climate Action Solutions Center on our website with lots of other resources that I would encourage you all to visit if you're interested in learning more. You can certainly sign up for our newsletter. We send out regular emails to a national list and also to our Massachusetts list. So you will stay abreast of anything having to do with climate action in schools if you sign up for our newsletter. And that is my 20 minutes. So thank you so much. I knew I breezed through that very quickly. I hope you kept up and I didn't speak too quickly, and I'm happy to go and talk through any of this in more detail since it's my favorite topic.
Well, clearly we all have a lot of homework reading to do. So well, we want to start with questions, and if people could put their questions into the chat, and then if you need to elaborate, you can elaborate, but we want to keep questions general enough that it will be applicable to more than your situation. So please keep that in mind in the way that you ask. And I assume that all of these tools are on the Undaunted K-12 website. Is that right?
Yes, pretty much. As usual with small nonprofits, we always have work to do to, get our website better organized, but there are links here in the slide. So to the extent I can send the slide deck out to you, Andrew, and you can distribute it. That will make sure that if you can't find it on our website, it is here in the links.
Great, thank you. We'll send that out afterwards.
Great.
So, so we wanted to start out just clarifying, sounds like IRA funds and Mass Save funds can both be used together.
Absolutely, yeah. They can definitely both be stacked together. And in fact, if you, so the Inflation Reduction Act on the left here, this is based on costs. So they're going to take, the total cost of the system. Again, my example from Amherst, let's round it to, $10 million. And you're going to get 30% off is kind of the base incentive with some assumptions, but let's just take that as the base. There's another 10% available if you use American-made steel in particular. American-made component steel will be the big one for an HVAC system. And then another 10% if you are located in an energy community, which maybe others on this call are more up to date. I don't know that the federal government has yet completely defined energy community. I don't think Amherst will be one. But there will be some in Massachusetts that will be available. So that's why we say kind of 30 to 50% of the cost. So that's the Inflation Reduction Act is based on the price tag. And that's coming from the federal government. Schools are, and again, the process is still being worked out for this. We expect guidance from the IRS soon, but schools will fill out a form to say, to show kind of how much they spent, and schools will be eligible to receive a direct cash payment from the federal government for the amount spent on this technology. And then on the Mass Save side, that's an incentive that's processed through our utilities and is actually based not on cost, but on size of the system. So it's a per ton, right? So our ground source heat pump in Amherst, based on the latest kind of design work, was going to be 280 tons. So, this incentive here of 1.6 million is based on 280 tons times that 4,500. There are some other little adders in there, I think, but generally speaking, it's a per tonnage. So these two absolutely can work together. They don't really have any way to talk to each other, and they're based on different bases, with Inflation Reduction Act based on cost, and the Mass Save incentive based on tons or size of system.
So, and we also all know, Russ just put into the chat, that insulating and envelope tightening is critical before putting in any kind of new systems. We're just would like you to go a little more into the recommendations you might have, or the kinds of funding that we will find in the various sources.
Absolutely. So when we're thinking about existing buildings and trying to introduce these highly efficient heat pumps to existing buildings, doing the envelope work first is absolutely critical. And that's why when it comes to existing buildings, I think encouraging districts to look at this deep energy retrofit pathway through the utilities is really going to be an important piece, because yes, it absolutely starts with the investments in the building envelope, so that we have good windows and doors, and we have our air sealing and good insulation around that envelope, because we are moving. These heat pumps work differently than the kind of burning fossil fuels, really high velocity HVAC systems that these old leaky buildings are operating in right now. So when we want to move to heat pumps and do that efficiently, we have to start by making investments in the envelope. Absolutely. And that's really why it's critical to put this opportunity on the radar of your district leaders really early, right? We can't wait until the boiler is on its last legs and needs to be pitched out next week, because we won't have time to make the enabling investments in the building envelope that are so critical, right? So this really requires some foresight and some planning with technical partners like our utility partners to do this well. I'm working with the Hadley School District right now, and through their long-term facilities planning, they know that they've got a boiler that's on its last legs. And rather than making a like-for-like replacement, they burn oil today. They said, look, we know we've only got a few years left in this oil boiler. We need to make sure that we have a pathway off this fossil fuel burning technology. So they're doing the work now to think about what is the work we need to do in the envelope to enable that switch. Because if we're waiting until it's a crisis, we're not going to be able to make the switch, because you're right, these investments in the shell are the enabling investments we need to make this move. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Since I'm on my phone, Adele, would you be able to read the questions in the chat and select or invite people to say their questions if it's not clear?
Yeah. Yes, I will do that. So one question is, are the Mass Save incentives already in implementation, or is that for the future?
No, these are available now. They were announced kind of last August, I think, was when we first got word of them in the context of the Amherst new construction project. And this is a brochure that you can download. This is what I'm showing right now online from MassSave. This is a brochure that you can download right from this web link here on their website right now. It's in their business section, and I kind of gave them a hard time because the language doesn't feel very school friendly. So can we get a version of this that invites more schools, that makes it clear that this is a place for them too? But yes, I assure you, it is a place for schools, and it is live now. And it makes sense to go to reach out to Matthew, because he's really our person for Western Mass that's responsible for helping all municipal customers, and that certainly includes schools, be more energy efficient.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So one person has asked, can you explain the data discrepancy in estimating the footprint of schools in the 2050 decarbonization roadmap? And yeah.
And, I can't, I went to them. Well, I don't have a good answer. I've talked to EEA about it. That's our, Energy and Environmental Affairs, the folks that put this report out. I talked to the consultants who created it. And it was basically just a bunch of this, like, oh, well, they told us, yeah, we knew it was off, but when the data came back and no one ever, I guess, so oops. And I think the bigger picture is that they didn't engage any schools audiences that would immediately see that this is wrong, right? So our Massachusetts School Building Authority that governs the investment of all of our sales tax dollars that we all pay into a fund that they invest into schools, they would know. If they look, their own reporting shows that it's well over close to 200 million square feet. So they just our state climate leaders are not adequately centering schools in the work and doing outreach to the groups around, even in state agencies that know school buildings inside and out. And that's certainly a message that we've been delivering to them as often as we can, and trying to really activate and build more bridges between our climate leaders in our state energy office and the rest of state government. And certainly my hope and aspiration is that our new climate leader, Melissa Hoffer, who has, many connections to Western Mass, including being a graduate of Hampshire and UMass, yay. Like my understanding is that her remit is to help build some of these bridges. So it's not just our energy agency, our EEA, trying to, drag this whole morass of state government along, but that all of our state agencies, including our Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, who would have seen this air easily, and our Massachusetts School Building Authority, that they see themselves in this work of climate, and that they are engaged on these reports, and they are catching silly and yet damaging errors like this one.
One person had a question about matching funds. Do the municipalities have to add matching funds in order to get these benefits, these incentives?
Well, so this, in the sense that for the Inflation Reduction Act, right, they're going to defray 30 to 50% of the cost. That's not 100% of the cost. So where does that other, X percent come from? In the case of our Amherst project, that will come largely from local bond issuance, right? Local funds. It's going to come partly from our state funds through the MSBA. So depending on the project, there's a hole here, right? Neither $4,500 per ton in the case of the MassSave incentive, nor the Inflation Reduction Act fund covers all of it. So there will be places where we have to fill out the kind of capital stack, if you will, with a variety of money, whether that's philanthropic funds, local match, other state dollars. This is certainly takes some financial engineering and organization to pull all these pieces together. And I should say private capital too, right? That's always an option, is for schools to use private sector capital, as we were talking about earlier on this call, using power purchase agreements in the case of solar, right? These these economics of 30 to 50% off from the federal government, are going to affect even the cost and the competitiveness of power purchase agreements, which is where you can kind of use third-party capital so that you don't have to upfront any of the capital yourself to do things like go solar.
Someone has asked whether there are incentives for buildings other than schools. I'm assuming that the answer to that is yes.
Well, my expertise in schools, but I can tell you this Inflation Reduction Act money for ground source heat pumps is purely based on the technology, and it doesn't say schools anywhere in there. So it's actually for any building that installs ground source heat pumps. Just like any place you put solar is also, this incentive is also available for that same technology. So there's a set of incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act that are kind of agnostic to site. And it's really just about, did you put this clean energy widget? Did you install this clean energy widget? If so, show me how much you spent and we'll defray the cost for you. So yes, these incentives for ground source heat pumps are available for all building types. And, you can look at this, the literature on the MassSave website, but I believe that, that's being marketed here as all commercial buildings. And so this pathway is available to all buildings. Yeah, as I understand it, all commercial buildings.
Someone has asked how to effectively engage with Matthew McTeague, who's on the slide.
Yeah, I would send him an email. He was very busy at the end of the year, but he told me, come the new year, I will have plenty of time for you, Sarah. So I would send him an email and say, ask about, whether he has your school on, any of his lists in terms of having recently done an audit, or, what he can tell you about your school and whether they are, on his radar in terms of engaging in energy efficiency work and, more extensively, engaging in this deep energy retrofit pathway. And, again, to the extent you are connected with your schools, and that's also a good place to start, is to go to your facilities lead and, ask whether they are exploring these opportunities to, work with utilities to reduce energy usage and decarbonize.
So Eversource certainly is active in Amherst, but we have National Grid here in Northampton. So I gather that you think Matthew McTeague is pretty responsive. Have you had any interactions with National Grid and how responsive they are?
I haven't, but it's on, after I had the conversation with Matthew, he said, you should come and speak with all of our municipal leads across all of and I said, yes, I would love to do that. So I can't vouch for anyone else yet, but it's on my to-do list for 2023 to get to know all of Matthew's compatriots at various parts of MassSave. Great.
Someone asked, how did Undaunted K-12 get started?
Jonathan is a very inspiring education leader. Jonathan Klein, my co-founder. He is not a climate leader, but he's about my age. So he's like kind of late 40s. He's been working for 20 or so years on educational equity. And he's out in the Bay Area, and out in the Bay Area, they've been running around with KN95 masks since long before COVID because of wildfires. And so, he and his family are very much, they live in a place, whereas all of who've been looking at the news, they're on the front lines of climate. He has kids around the same age as my kids. I have a junior and an 8th grader, and his oldest at the time was in 9th grade. So this is a few years ago, and she asked him to chaperone her and her friends at the big 2019 climate strike in San Francisco. So there, Jonathan Klein was education leader of many years, walking among throngs of young people, including his daughter, at big climate march that happened in 2019. And this, kind of awakening happened for him, that this was the thing that his kids and all the kids he had been serving for decades were going to hold him most accountable for. And it was the thing that was actually undermining all the years of work he had been doing in schools like Compton to try and advance educational equity. It's like, well, geez, they don't have air conditioning. They can't even go to school anymore, right? They're not being equipped to participate in this clean energy transition. That is a massive wealth creation opportunity. And so he had the light bulb go off, knew nothing about climate, and got introduced to me as someone who had been kicking around in this space for a while. And so again, we kind of complement each other with him having this deep expertise in education and having this kind of light bulb moment for himself. And then, me coming in as the climate leader with my light bulb moment happening years earlier here in Amherst, doing this work on to retrofit our own house. So that was how we kind of got started, through our 2 different personal stories and kind of climate awakenings, and then good old fashioned networking bringing us together. So we actually met right at the beginning of COVID, and we didn't see each other for the first year we were working together. We did what we are all doing here today. So it wasn't until he and I met in Washington, D.C. for a meeting at the Department of Education that we actually laid eyes on each other in person. So that's how Undaunted got started.
Inspiring.
Sarah, I'm curious if you have a sense of how the school building authority is reacting. Are they going to be with the program, or are they going to reduce the grants to schools based on the kinds of grants that are available from IRA or Mass Save?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because they are kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to defining the landscape for our school infrastructure. And the program that they have right now is 12 years old in terms of its mentality and its approach to advancing the ball here. It's really an energy efficiency playbook. It's not a decarbonization playbook at all. And in fact, their accelerated repair program, which is a thing that helps schools fix the boiler when the boiler goes kaput, is actually organized to make like-for-like replacements. That is, taking the gas boiler out and putting a new gas boiler in, the thing that is easiest for schools to do, rather than having a program that disrupts that pattern. So I would characterize them as unhelpfully agnostic when it comes to electrification and climate right now, and they need to be a climate leader. And so that they're one of the key targets of our work when it comes to state policy advocacy, and is exactly the thing I wrote to Melissa Hoffer, our new climate chief, about getting the MSBA on board as an agent for positive change here, because right now it is generous to call them agnostic, right? So we really need a lot more out of them. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act and the money that's sitting on the shelf available for school districts across the country and in Massachusetts is a great excuse for them to have to kind of reorient their approach, because if they're not helping schools take advantage of that funding, we are not only working against our own climate goals, we are also leaving money on the table that the Biden administration has on the shelf that is available for this work. So we're kind of like doubly shooting ourselves in the foot here.
Do you have any suggestions for advocacy work that activists might do around this?
I think people should sign up for our newsletter. And when we have advocacy that is directed at the MSBA, you will hear about it and be the first to know. And I would welcome all of your voices on it. Right now, I think direct advocacy to the MSBA right now is not something that I feel equipped to lead effectively, and that we have gotten enough sensibility around how to do that effectively. They are not an organization that what I've heard is they are not an organization that takes well to that approach. So I've been trying to unpack that some more and really figure out what our strategy is going to be. There was a letter that Emily Norton from, I think she's at Clean Water Action. I can't remember now where she is, Emily Norton, but she did organize
Charles River
Charles River, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I knew I was getting that wrong. She organized a municipal leaders letter back in April of 2020, maybe, or 2021. I'm getting COVID time, has it all kind of a little bit unclear for me. That was directed at the MSBA and asked them to really kind of, move towards all electric, requirements for all electric new construction and, climate ready schools and adaptation. And they had a meeting and it kind of sort of went nowhere. And that had, 8 pages of municipal leader names on it. Some of those are people on this call right now. So not to say that, N of 1 is the whole story, but I think it's going to have to be more of an insider influence game. Certainly external advocacy can help, but I think we've got to get our ducks in line in terms of some of the new internal champions that we have in a new administration.
Andra, how many more minutes do we have for questions?
I think we can go another 5.
Okay, so I have one more question in the chat, which is, who do you recommend that advocates talk to in a school system? The facilities manager versus the school committee chair, superintendent, et cetera?
Yeah, I think school board members and superintendents are really important to get on board. The facilities folks are great, but they're not gonna do the kind of wholesale, multi-year, well-resourced change that is really what we need. As we talked about earlier with ground source heat pumps, this is not a take one light bulb out, put a new one in. This is open heart surgery on the building, right? This requires massive multi-year commitment. To do that, you need a superintendent that understands what's at stake here, right? That's why HVAC choices for student health and learning. You need a school board that is behind that superintendent and helping her every step of the way. So, I really think the 2 advocacy toolkits that we, talked about later on here, this one is great kind of as a framework. I've given this to my superintendent, this document, this thick. And this playbook really talks about school board members and how to target that audience. I think these are great resources that really will help advocates understand who to go to and some of the messaging for this work.
Is there a Massachusetts community that is currently way ahead of all the rest and taking advantage of IRA funds, et cetera?
IRA funds are new, right? They are just kind of out the door and some of that guidance is still working out. So I hope Amherst will be one of the first communities to take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act in particular. But in terms of kind of manifesting a lot of these technologies in a school building, Acton-Boxborough is, kind of way out in front with a building that is, zero emissions, ground source heat pump. They are doing rainwater capture. So the rainwater that hits their roof, they're capturing that and using it for their toilets, which I didn't know are responsible for 80% of the water usage at a school. They have plans to do solar on their building and in a carport. They are a very wealthy community. They've built a beautiful school that showcases all the widgets. So from that perspective, I think they're doing great stuff. From a municipality that is embraced and is planning a pathway for their schools, I think the town of Arlington is way out ahead. They put out an RFP for an electrification and air quality master plan for their schools, right? That said, look at all of our schools and we need a plan to electrify all of them. And with this, again, this important focus of pairing that with air quality, kind of get the health piece involved there also. So in terms of stepping back and looking at the portfolio of existing buildings, I think the work that Arlington's doing is really leading. And then I think there's a school in downtown Boston called Josiah Quincy that's being worked on. That's right near the highway that serves a minority population in terms of their student body. And they're doing great work to figure out how an urban school can really contend with some of the worst air quality in the whole state and still create healthy learning environments for students. So Josiah Quincy Upper School in downtown Boston.
Adele, I think you might have missed a question from a guy named Steve Jones.
Which question from Steve Jones? He's asked a lot of questions. For those people who don't know, Steve Jones is my husband, so I'm not gonna say things like that. Okay, which question are you referring to, Andrew?
Something about, can you really
Oh, how close to net zero
To
can a
net zero.
school actually get? Well, in particular, I guess I would ask the question for existing schools undergoing a deep energy retrofit. I would assume that new schools can pretty much get to net zero.
Yeah, you know, this is all going to depend on the site. So an urban site that has a really hard time installing solar, it's going to be harder, right? I mean, this is all this kind of seesaw of like just how energy efficient can you get your building and how much PV can you slap on to offset it. If we're talking about net zero energy, of course, we could go down the net zero carbon rabbit hole and all other things, but just staying there at the level of energy for the moment. In the case of retrofits, it totally can be done. There's an example in Connecticut. I don't believe we have one yet. I know we don't have one yet in Massachusetts, but Buckley Elementary in Connecticut, and I can put it in the chat, is an example of a net zero energy retrofit, an existing building that they retrofit to be net zero. We need to get our first one of those in Massachusetts.
Oops. And I just want to answer Pam. You have a utility, I think it's Eversource, and Greenfield is absolutely going to be eligible for those incentives. You do pay into Mass Save. It's a question that's worth asking though about municipal light plants and if there's any help for them.
Yeah, that is a gap in my knowledge. I will be honest and answer. I do not know.
We're not a municipal light plant town. We just have aggregated electricity.
Right. But that means that you're a utility town, so you'll be able to get advantage of Mass Save. So, yeah. I want to thank you, Sarah. This was illuminating and very, very interesting for future work. I'm sure that a number of people on this call are going to be in touch with you about some specifics.
Great.
And thank you for all your excellent work with Unfund.
My pleasure. Thanks to all of you. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everything that you all do. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now